Good morning and welcome to today's Joint Energy and Research and Technology Subcommittee hearing examining cyber threats to American energy systems. Today we will hear from an expert panel on the growing threat of cyber attacks to the nation's electric grid. Our witnesses today will also provide insight into how industry and the federal government are working together, or maybe in some instances not working together, to anticipate cyber threats and improve the reliability and resiliency of our electric grid against those cyber attacks. The reliability of America's power grid is one of our greatest economic strengths. I like to say the things that make America great are the things that America makes. Now, how do we do that? With an affordable, reliable, dependable electric supply. In my home state of Texas, reliable and affordable power serves a population that is increasing at the rate of more than 1,000 people a day, and it provides power to the energy-intensive industries that drive consumption. Texas is by far the nation's largest consumer of electricity. Keeping the Texas power grid reliable and secure is key to continuing this economic growth. But as we established in a hearing on broad threats to the power supply earlier this year, utilities face significant threats to that same reliable delivery of power. Our electric grid is particularly vulnerable to growing cybersecurity threats as the grid is modernized, as distributed energy, electric vehicles, and modernized digital operating systems create more access points for cyber attacks. And while the nation's industrial control systems for the grid are analog systems designed to last for decades, digital IT systems must constantly adapt to combat evolving cyber threats. Small-scale cyber and physical attacks to our electric grid are estimated to occur once every 4 days. And in over 300 cases of significant cyber and physical attacks since 2011, suspects have never been identified. Now, let me repeat that. In over 300 cases of significant cyber and physical attacks since 2011, no suspects have been identified. We often think of cybersecurity and other threats to the power grid at a macro scale, but these types of attacks can occur even at a local level. In 2011, the Pedernales Electric Co-op, a nonprofit co-op that serves approximately 200,000 customers north of San Antonio, was struck by a cyber attack. While the attack thankfully did not disrupt power to consumers, it is a stark reminder that threats to the grid are real, and they are not going to go away anytime soon. Our nation's power supply cannot be protected overnight, particularly as utilities study to adapt technology to manage a growing number of cybersecurity threats. Cyber threats to the power grid will continue to evolve, particularly as more interconnected smart technologies are incorporated into the electric grid. We call those smart meters back in Texas. And as protective technology improves, so does the capability and creativity of those who are conducting those cyber attacks, unfortunately. While we cannot predict every method of attack, the federal government can and should play a role in assisting industry with developing new technology and security safeguards. Accordingly, research and development efforts at the Department of Energy are focused on providing industry with comprehensive tools to conduct internal analysis to identify and address cybersecurity weaknesses so that the industry can take the lead in addressing those same vulnerabilities. That's why testing facilities and cooperative research like the Cybersecurity Test Bed at Idaho National Lab are valuable tools to combat cyber threats. At INL, industry can test control systems technology in real-world conditions, reducing response time and risk for future attacks. I'd like to say in advance I want to thank the witnesses for testifying before the committee today. I look forward to a discussion about cyber threats to our critical infrastructure and how the federal government can provide industry with the tools and technology necessary to fight the next generation of cyber attacks. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Chairman Weber, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for participating. As many of you know, October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so it's a fitting time for this hearing today. We're all familiar with the increasing frequency of cyber attacks that compromise personal and business information. At the World Economic Summit earlier this year, cyber threats made the top 10 list of the most likely global risks. Lloyd's of London estimates that cyber attacks can cost businesses as much as $400 billion a year. What we're focusing on today is a different kind of cybersecurity. It's about securing the electric grid so that a cyber attack doesn't affect grid operations, which could halt our daily lives, threaten our economic security. These attacks often gain entry through an information technology system, but instead of taking corporate data, they directly target system operations that can cause havoc and chaos. In February of this year, an elite group of hackers broke through an electric utility's firewall and gained access to their substation controls in just 22 minutes. Luckily, this attack was a drill, initiated at the request of the utility to test their system. But this example demonstrates what's possible. The energy sector continues to report more cyber attacks to the Department of Homeland Security, more than any other critical infrastructure sector. In just 1 month, the PJM interconnection, which coordinates electricity transactions in 13 states and in DC, experienced 4,090 documented cyber attempts to attack their system. That's more than 5.5 attacks on their electrical market system per hour. So far, no publicly reported cyber events have resulted in an electricity outage in the United States, but the sophistication of attacks on industrial control systems is increasing. Utilities across our country are advancing energy efficiency through smart grids and programs like feed-in tariff systems. As we discuss ways to keep the grid safe, we also must be mindful of doing so without inhibiting innovation. Google, Wells Fargo, and Aetna are currently exploring ways to leverage employee behavior as a tool instead of a vulnerability to build a more secure system. From understanding how people swipe their phones to the patterns they use when typing on a keyboard or walking, a better understanding of behavioral biometrics is opening the door to developing more cyber-secure components and processes. The more we understand about human and social behavior, the stronger our toolbox. Rather than resting the success of our cybersecurity efforts on programs that require changes in human behavior, we might have better success if we change our technology and processes to better fit the behavior of people. And the more we understand the behavior of threat actors, the better we can design protections. So in addition to building a better technology-based firewall, we need to invest in developing a better human firewall. Our weakest link and our most resilient asset to meet the dynamic changing needs of the cyber arms race is us. I thank each of our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing what each of you has to say, and thank you for sharing your expertise. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you to the gentlelady from Oregon. Our first witness today is Mr. Brent Stacey, Associate Lab Director for National and Homeland Science and Technology at that Idaho National Laboratory. Mr. Stacey earned his bachelor's degree from Idaho State University. Our next witness is Mr. Bennett Gaines, Senior Vice President, Corporate Services and Chief Information Officer for FirstEnergy Service Company. Mr. Gaines earned his bachelor's degree in social sciences from Baldwin Wallace College and his master's degree from the University of Phoenix. Next, we have Ms. Annabelle Lee, Senior Technical Executive in the Power Delivery and Utilization Sector for the Electric Power Research Institute. Ms. Lee received her BA from Stanford University and her master's degree from Michigan State University. And our final witness today is Mr. Greg Wilshusen. Is it Wilshusen? Wilshusen. Yes. Okay. So the rest of the committee is duly notified. Wilshusen, Director of Information Security Issues for the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Wilshusen received his bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Missouri and his master's degree in information management from George Washington University School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Welcome to all of y'all. And Mr. Stacey, you are recognized. You'll let me know when the chairman comes in. Okay.
Thank you, Chairman Weber, Chairwoman Comstock, Ranking Member Grayson, Ranking Member Lipinski, and distinguished members of the committees. I want to thank you for holding this hearing and inviting testimony from Idaho National Laboratory, also known as INL. INL is acutely aware of the important national challenges facing critical infrastructure, especially the infrastructure vital to securing our energy supply. For over a decade, INL has developed and built capabilities focused on the control systems employed by our nation's critical infrastructure. I'd like to highlight a few examples out of many which represent how INL, teaming with others, has contributed to the security of our infrastructure. First, the 2006 Department of Homeland Security's Aurora project test, destroying an electrical generator connected to INL's power grid, was significant in proving a cyber-physical vulnerability in the electric power system. Second, for DOE Office of Electricity Distribution and Energy Reliability, as the lead laboratory along with Sandia National Laboratory for the National Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Testbed, INL completed more than 100 assessments on vendor and asset owner control systems to identify and resolve cyber vulnerabilities. For DHS, INL provides control systems and critical infrastructure experts in support of DHS programs, including Industrial Control System Cyber Emergency Response Team, or ICS CERT. INL remains committed to the complex national security challenges that face our nation. As we lean forward, pushing the limits of science and engineering for control system security, we see a number of trends that offer insight into the direction for future research and development. These insights include, 1, the presumption that a control system is air-gapped is not an effective cybersecurity strategy. This has been demonstrated by over 600 assessments. Intrusion detection technology is not well developed for control system networks. The average length of time for detection of a malware intrusion is 4 months and typically identified by a third party. As the complexity and interconnectedness of control systems increase, the probability increases for unintended system failures of high consequence, independent of malicious intent. The dynamic threat is evolving faster than the cycle of measure and countermeasure, and far faster than the evolution of policy. And fifth, the demand for trained cyber defenders with control systems knowledge vastly exceeds the supply. In a world in which we are rapidly migrating to the Internet of Everything, these insights and others highlight a seemingly unmanageable, exponentially increasing burden of vulnerabilities, attack surfaces, and interdependencies. INL views this dynamic cyber-physical landscape at its most basic level as a 3-tier pyramid of defense. The base level is hygiene, the foundation of our nation's efforts composed of the day-to-day measure and countermeasure battle. Elements of this level include important routine tasks such as standards, compliance, and patching. The hygiene level is and has been primarily the role of industry. The second level of the pyramid is advanced persistent threat, composed of the more sophisticated criminal and nation-states persistent campaigns. This requires a strategic partnership between industry and government. At this level, ICS CERT provides critical surge response capacity and alerts. At the top of this pyramid are the high-impact, low-frequency events, catastrophic and potentially cascading events that will likely require substantial time to assess, respond to, and recover from. This level is primarily the responsibility of government. At INL, we are focusing our future research on the top 2 levels, striving for 2 to 4 year research to deployment cycle. Our objective with this research is to achieve transformational innovations that improve the security of our power infrastructure by reducing complexity, implementing cyber-informed design, and integrating selected digital enhancements. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the committee members for this opportunity to share our insights into the capabilities, experiences, and vision for cybersecurity and the protection of our nation's power grid. Your interest in understanding cybersecurity threats with an emphasis on the reliability of our national power grid is commendable and gives me confidence that there is a strong support from our legislators for research leading to innovative solutions. One of my intentions today is to instill reciprocal confidence that INL, in concert with DOE and DOE laboratories, will continue to apply our intellectual talent and research to address these challenges. In honoring the time allotted for my statement, I request my full written statement be entered into the record. Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Gaines, you're up.
Good morning, Chairman Weber and members of the committee. I am Bennett Gaines, Senior Vice President, Corporate Services, Chief Information Officer for FirstEnergy. Our 10 operating companies serve 6 million electric customers in 6 states, and we control an interconnected network of power plants, transmission lines, and distribution facilities. I am responsible for providing information technology services, ensuring the security of the company's physical and cyber assets. Over the past few years, FirstEnergy has worked with the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and Congress, sharing steps we are taking to address cyber threats, as well as developing partnerships with the federal government in these efforts. In 2013, FirstEnergy was one of only a handful of utilities that entered into a cooperative research development agreement, or CRADA, with Homeland Security, a relationship that has proven valuable to both us and the federal government. In 2014, we began working directly with the Department of Energy as one of the first utilities to deploy the Cybersecurity Risk Information Sharing Program, or CRISP tool. We strongly believe that sharing this information of critical information is essential and should be actively supported moving forward. The fact is, although the cybersecurity efforts of electric utilities have been effective in addressing threats to date, we need to continually strengthen and build on these efforts to ensure they are up to the task of meeting the future cyber-related challenges. Operational and technical advances have created broader surfaces that are more vulnerable to attacks. Companies continue to integrate remote access, mobile devices that increase exposure. High-value targets such as supervisory control, data acquisition, or SCADA systems further entice attackers to take advantage of an organization. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and the behavior of cyber terrorists has become increasingly destructive. Many companies are doing an excellent job with prevention through layered defenses, real-time alerting, operational monitoring, security awareness training, and other proven tactics. However, in light of today's threats and vulnerabilities, we need to focus more of our attention on getting ahead of the threats rather than simply reacting to the threats. Toward that end, we need to take aggressive steps to mitigate vulnerabilities and minimize the damage and business losses that could result from potential compromises. At FirstEnergy, we're evaluating cyber threats to our communications network by integrating more traditional data regarding physical access systems and the status of equipment and health and on our power systems. This process, called Threat Intelligence Management, or TIM, provides a more comprehensive, system-wide, consistent picture that our Security Operations Center can use to improve our response to cyber attacks. While any information can be shared, it also must be aggregated, correlated, analyzed, and distilled to be relevant and actionable. By supporting these essential functions, TIM helps us maintain a critical infrastructure that is both highly secure and resilient. The program analyzes a constant flow of information from every corner of the system to anticipate and detect threats. This data can be shared among government and industry partners to enhance awareness of threats and provide more warning information to better mitigate attacks. Simply put, TIM offers a better platform for information sharing. The program not only helps us better identify and analyze threats and attacks, it also supports more effective information sharing and greater collaboration among all stakeholders. This results in more threat indicators, improved security, greater resilience of critical infrastructure, and ultimately more effective collaboration between industry and government. Finally, the TIM program provides enhanced visibility of the enterprise overall security posture. This is accomplished by coordinating the monitoring of cybersecurity, physical security, information technology, and operational technologies. Advanced analysis of these functions provide early warning of security incidents and rapid mitigation of vulnerabilities. In closing, we must continually improve our cybersecurity systems and processes to stay ahead of the bad actors. To give you a greater sense of the size and scope of the problem, I simply point out that during my brief time here today, FirstEnergy probably has defended itself from at least 4 cyber attacks. As you consider where to focus your efforts moving forward, I urge you to look towards greater research and funding in this area with a focus on aggregating, correlating, analyzing, and distilling information in order to be relevant and actionable. I strongly believe that one of the best ways to achieve this goal is through an effective threat intelligence management program. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines. Ms. Lee, you're now recognized.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the subcommittees. The Electric Power Research Institute is an independent, nonprofit organization and conducts research and development relating to the generation, delivery, and use of electricity for the benefit of the public. The nation's power system consists of both legacy and next-generation technologies. New grid technologies will operate in conjunction with legacy equipment that may be several decades old and provide no security controls. Traditional information technology, IT devices, typically have a lifespan of 3 to 5 years, and historically, IT has included computer systems, applications, communications technology, and software typical for a business or enterprise. In contrast, operational technology, or OT, devices have a lifespan of up to 40 years or longer and have historically focused on physical equipment technology that is commonly used to operate the energy sector. There are some basic differences between the security requirements for IT and OT systems. For example, the focus for IT systems is confidentiality of information, such as customer energy usage and privacy information. The focus for OT systems is availability and integrity to ensure that the reliability of the grid is maintained even in the event of a cybersecurity incident. With the increase in the use of digital devices and more advanced communications in IT, the overall attack surface has increased. These new devices include commercially available components as an alternative to proprietary solutions that are specific to the electric sector. Many of the commercially available solutions have known vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the solutions are installed in OT devices. The electric sector is addressing these attacks with various mitigation strategies. Cybersecurity must be included in all phases of the system development lifecycle and address deliberate attacks launched by disgruntled employees and nation-states, as well as non-malicious cybersecurity events, for example, user errors or incorrect documentation. Risk assessment is a key planning tool for implementation of an effective cybersecurity program. EPRI, in conjunction with utilities, researchers, and vendors, developed a risk assessment methodology that is based on a typical IT methodology with impact and likelihood criteria that are specific to the electric sector. This work was performed as part of the National Electric Sector Cybersecurity Organization Resource, or NESCOR for short, project, a DOE-funded public-private partnership. Several utilities are implementing mitigation strategies at the enterprise level. One example is an Integrated Security Operations Center, or ISOC for short. An ISOC is designed to collect, integrate, and analyze alarms and logs from traditionally siloed organizations, providing much greater situational awareness to the utility security team. Two documents specifically address the electric sector and provide mitigation strategy. Both documents are used worldwide. The first is the National Institute of Standards and Technology Interagency Report, Guidelines for Smart Grid Cybersecurity. The development was led by NIST with a team of roughly 150 volunteers. A second document is the Electricity Subsector Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, which allows electric utilities and grid operators to assess their cybersecurity capabilities and prioritize their actions and investments to improve cybersecurity. Many utilities and EPRI map their R&D programs to the domains specified in this maturity model. With the modernization of the electric grid, new technologies and devices have been deployed to meet our current and future electric sector needs. With this new functionality comes new threats, including cybersecurity threats. To take advantage of the new technology, these threats must be addressed. This concludes my statement.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Wilshusen, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Weber, Representative Bonamici, and other members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on efforts by federal agencies and industry to mitigate cybersecurity threats to the U.S. power systems. As you know, the electric power industry is increasingly incorporating information and communications technologies into its existing infrastructure. The use of these technologies can provide many benefits, such as greater efficiency and lower costs to consumers. However, if not implemented securely, modernized electricity grid systems will be vulnerable to attack and that could result in loss of electrical services essential to maintaining our national economy and security. Today, I'll discuss actions taken and required to bolster cybersecurity of the nation's power systems. Before I begin, if I may, I'd like to recognize several members of my team who were instrumental in developing my statement and performing the work underpinning it. With me today is Mike Gilmore, an Assistant Director, and Brad Becker, who led this effort. In addition, Lee McCracken, John Ludwigson, and Scott Pettis also made significant contributions. In 2011, we reported on a number of challenges that industry and government stakeholders faced in securing smart grid systems and networks against cyber threats. These challenges included taking a comprehensive approach to cybersecurity, ensuring that smart grid systems had built-in security measures, monitoring implementation of cybersecurity standards and guidelines, effectively sharing cybersecurity information, and establishing cybersecurity metrics. Since then, FERC acted to implement our recommendation to assess these and other challenges are in its ongoing cybersecurity efforts. However, it did not implement our recommendation to coordinate with state regulators and other groups to periodically evaluate the extent to which utilities and manufacturers are following voluntary cybersecurity guidelines. Other entities have acted to improve cybersecurity in the sector. For example, NERC has issued updates to its critical infrastructure protection standards for cybersecurity and has hosted an annual conference on grid security. In 2014, NIST updated its smart grid cybersecurity guidelines to address the threat of combined physical cyber attacks. NIST also issued a framework for improving critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity. The framework is intended to provide a flexible and risk-based approach for entities, including those within the electricity subsector, to protect their vital assets from cyber threats. The Departments of Homeland Security and Energy have efforts underway to promote the adoption of the framework by critical infrastructure owners and operators. These departments have also developed cybersecurity risk management approaches and tools that are available for use by the electricity subsector. Nevertheless, given the increasing use of information and communications technologies to operate the electricity grid and other areas, it is required to continued attention to these and other areas is required to help mitigate the risk these threats pose to the electricity grid. In particular, assuring that security features are built into smart grid systems and that a comprehensive approach to cybersecurity is taken whereby utilities employ a defense in depth strategy based on sound risk management principles will be essential. Effectively sharing cyber threat, vulnerability, and incident information among federal, state, and local governments, as well as the private sector stakeholders in a timely manner is imperative to provide utilities with the information they need to protect their assets against cyber threats. Additionally, an effective mechanism for monitoring the implementation and effectiveness of the cybersecurity policies, practices, and controls over U.S. power systems is paramount to ensure the resiliency and security of the electricity grid. To summarize, more needs to be done to meet the challenges facing the industry in enhancing security. Federal regulators and other stakeholders need to work closely with the private sector to address cybersecurity challenges as the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity come to rely more on emerging and interconnected technologies. Chairman Weber and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wilshusen. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Questions? Wow, where do we start? Mr. Gaines, the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity works with electric utilities on information sharing, encouraging utilities to learn from the challenges faced by their regional counterparts. The Department of Homeland Security also operates programs to facilitate that information sharing. You referred to it in your comments. What information do you feel is most important to share with each other and for the industry to share with regulators? And the third part to my question really is, in your comments, I think you said information had to be actionable.
Correct.
Define what you mean by actionable. Let me reiterate. What information do you feel is most important for industry to share with each other, and then to share with the regulators that may be one and the same, and then define actionable information for us?
I'll start out with your first questions in that we have spent the last 2 years working directly with both agencies and within the confines of the programs that they have, which are the CRIS tool and the enhanced cybersecurity tool, and they are very effective. The difficulty of both of those tools, they're historical. They look back. They don't look at real-time incidents, and in some cases there can be a lag between 3 to 6 months from when an incident occurred. It's not correlated on a timely manner as to what is going on with the rest of the industry so that we can take action on those events. And in some cases, you could have a dormant piece of malware sitting in your environment that you didn't take action on, but that was alerted months earlier. As it relates to actionable, it's having real-time information. And a technical term I don't want to lose you is the actual threat actors, IP address, and the specific information that's time-framed within that window. An illustration of that would
No,
be...
you're not losing me. I was wondering about that earlier when it said up to 4 months since 2011, 300 attacks, and no suspects.
That's
Go ahead.
correct.
Go ahead.
And that is the difficulty, is that by the time the actor penetrates your environment, they're not the actor that you see. There's an alias that sits behind that wall, and the difficulty is following that breadcrumb back to the original source. And one of the difficulties that we have in the industry is the information we get from the federal government is not timely. And so for us to take action on something that really we have no control over is very difficult. My suggestion would be to reverse that, is for us to provide across the industry real-time incidents, and it's doable, and to be able to track not only the source, but the actual follow-on activity that occurs from that event. One of the things that we don't do is we don't do a good diagnostics of what happens once the event occurs, and we move on to the next one.
Okay, let me jump over to Mr. Wilshusen. You talked about having conferences, I think, where you met around the country, probably industry, and I presume government as well. How often are those conferences held, and how many attendees? And should we increase that frequency, and are they sharing that information?
Well, these, what I refer to were conferences that were being held by NERC, which is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And they hold those annually. But to the extent that Mr. Gaines talked about in providing useful, actionable information in a timely manner, annual is not enough. They do talk about different threats.
Oh, it almost have to be daily or weekly.
Much more frequently.
Absolutely.
This has been
I'm talking about the sharing of the information.
right, the sharing of the information, particularly between federal government to private sector, and then even among private sector entities, has been a longstanding problem and a challenge throughout all critical infrastructure sectors, including this one, electricity sector. What we have found in the past is that there have been certain obstacles to doing that, including from the government side to private sectors, making sure that those individuals at the private sector had the appropriate security clearances. That's been a challenge, as well as having a secure mechanism to share that information timely.
Is there one office that oversees what you're describing? Is there one office within your agency, for example, that oversees that? Who oversees that?
Well, overall, DHS has a responsibility across federal government for taking the lead in the critical.
So, but does DHS, you may not know this, forgive me for interrupting, but does DHS have one office that is allocates their time and manpower and resources to just this cybersecurity for energy companies alone? Do you know?
Well, it does have a group that's responsible for overall, but it's also the Department of Energy, who is what is known as a sector-specific agency that has responsibility for interacting with the energy sector, to include the electricity sector, for sharing information and assisting that sector in securing its systems.
Okay, I am running out of time, but I have one last question. So what could be done better to help fix it, to streamline this process?
Well, one of the requirements under the Executive Order 13636 is for agencies, and particularly I think it's DOD and perhaps DHS, to come up with a mechanism that will allow for faster sharing of information to the private sector.
Oh, all right, thank you. I'm over time, and I yield to the gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for bringing your expertise on this important issue. I also serve on the Education and Workforce Committee, and I'm going to focus at first on some of the workforce issues, making sure that we have the workforce that we need to continue addressing this serious issue. And I know, Mr. Stacey, you said that the demand for trained cyber defenders with control systems knowledge vastly exceeds the supply. Now, my alma mater, the University of Oregon, has just created an Oregon Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy. They received some federal funding and a Center of Excellence designation, and they plan to begin enrolling students by next summer. But how can we incentivize more universities to support educating this workforce? And once we have a strong pipeline of students and get them into the workforce, how can we attract them to public service and government jobs when typically the private sector would pay more and be perceived as more innovative? So I'll start with Ms. Lee and also ask Mr. Wilshusen and anybody who wants to weigh in.
As I noted in my statement, I previously was in the federal government for 14 years. I think one of the real advantages of working in the federal government is the kind of work you can do and the impact that you have. I mentioned the Guidelines for Smart Grid Cybersecurity product that we developed. There were 150 volunteers from around the world that participated in developing that document. These were senior level people literally around the world. I kept getting asked, do you pay these people? And my response was, no, these are volunteers. I think one thing in the federal government, and working with the federal government for several decades, you can have an impact and influence that you don't have anywhere else. And to me, that's a real benefit for working in the public sector. Private sector does compete. It is difficult now. There are very few, as mentioned earlier, there are not significant numbers of people who are in cybersecurity, and those who focus on control systems. And as I mentioned, there are some basic differences between cybersecurity for control systems and our IT systems. That community is even smaller. We need to beef up that workforce. There are controls that you don't put on OT systems that are typical on IT systems. And we definitely need to grow this area.
And do you agree with Mr. Stacey that there's a serious need that we don't have the workforce?
We don't have the workforce.
I want to follow up because I know the U of O Center is going to be working with the faculty from several different departments, including computer and information science, philosophy, business, law. What role, you talked about the role of human behavior, but how can we really capitalize on understanding human behavior to deal with the threats and also hopefully to be out in front and prevent them? I'll open it up to the panel. Ms. Lee, do you want to start?
As you mentioned, I think human behavior is very important. Historically, and I've been doing cybersecurity now for almost 3 decades, the solution was have longer passwords, and so what does everybody do? They write them down because you can't remember 12 or 15 character passwords that you have to change every 3 or 4 months.
We've all done that.
Yeah, and yeah, you write them down. That's the only way you can remember them, is to look at cybersecurity, and the solution has to be, yes, we need to figure it out. This, as I say, it's a messy environment. If you look at the reality of cybersecurity, the devices that are out there, the controls you may need to implement, you can't do. You either can't afford them or they affect the performance. You need to figure out the solutions. And I think that's the direction that cybersecurity needs to go. Historically,
Thank you. And I need to get a couple more questions. And Mr. Gaines, you talked about the TIM, the Threat Intelligence Management. That seems like a sound approach. What are the barriers to improving and expanding that approach?
The barriers are twofold. One, there are limitations that industry has today in communicating with the government vulnerabilities. And that is a real challenge in that we are limited to some extent because we hold the liability if there's a breach or vulnerability to the network. I think that needs to be looked at and in some cases eliminated so that we can share openly very specific information about vulnerabilities. The second is the actual technologies themselves. Today, we are one of only 2 utilities that have a completely integrated security operations center. And Ms. Lee spoke about that center. It's a center that we integrate the physical, being badge access, building access. We integrate the IT, being the cyber component, and we integrate the operational, the SCADA systems together. All 3 of those systems are actually monitored, reviewed, and we take actions against events. And I'll use a simple analogy so you could understand.
I'm afraid my time's going to expire. Can I have just a few more seconds, Mr. Chairman?
Without objection.
I want to get a quick question for Mr. Wilshusen. You mentioned in your testimony that FERC was adopting standards from NIST's efforts, but according to FERC officials, the statute did not provide any authority to allow FERC to require the smart grid technologies to follow the standards, and now it's voluntary. How's that working?
Well, it is voluntary, and that's one of the problems that we noted is that FERC is not, because it's voluntary and has not been adopted, it has not gone out to examine the effectiveness or the extent to which those voluntary standards have been implemented.
Thank you, and I'm very over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
No problem. And now the chairman is pleased to recognize for his first appearance in this hearing in this committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Darren LaHood. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Appreciate it. Great to be part of this subcommittee. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony this morning. I guess, Mr. Stacey, I wanted to just maybe see if you could highlight a couple examples of cyber attacks that have maybe recently happened where systems have been compromised, and maybe the cost to a particular company and how it affected citizens or customers.
Yes, 2 of the most recent are Black Energy and Havix attacks. These have been to the human-machine interface associated with the industrial control systems. Near as we can tell, those are primarily associated with collecting information, trying to map out systems and see what they look like, although the payloads on those are dynamic. There's been a very active response from DHS on this, along with other entities, in fact, traveling around the country in briefings with the FBI and notifying people about that. As far as the costs associated with individual utilities in mitigating that, I don't have insight into that, but I know the federal government and the laboratory took a very aggressive stance on notifying and making people aware of those particular malware.
And I guess as a follow-up maybe to Mr. Gaines, when we talk about when we talk about cybersecurity and talk about really what these entities are engaged in is criminal activity, when we talk about deterring that, I mean, are there currently any active prosecutions by the federal government, either the U.S. Attorney's Office or anybody that has that we can kind of use as examples to deter this behavior?
I'm not aware of any criminal activity. So I say that. I do know that there have been incidents that have been nation state and or in some cases domestic that probably warrant the investigation of that. A good example of that would have been the Metcalf incident that occurred in Southern California in 2013. That substation lost 17 transformers. There were 127 rounds of ammunition that was shot into the substation, and power had to be rerouted. To the chairman's point, though, that actor has not, and or actors have not been found, and the evidence obviously is very clear that it was multiple actors, very potentially. But to the extent that there has been prosecution, that has not occurred. To my knowledge.
And is there, on that specific case with Metcalf, is there an ongoing investigation to try to determine who the perpetrator was?
There absolutely is. And following that incident, FERC issued a number of standards on physical security that the industry is now implementing. And a lot of that has to do with both the monitoring, both of the physical asset and the cyber asset. And so we've learned from an industry, but to the extent that we've seen that replicated or duplicated in the industry, it has not.
In terms of becoming aware when a system is compromised, walk me through a little bit of, if a company is compromised, the reporting on that in terms of to the federal government. Is that something that's made public, or who's the repository of threats or compromises that happen, and then how does that get made public, or is there some secrecy involved with that? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at, do companies, in a competitive marketplace not want people to be aware that their systems were compromised for vulnerabilities? How is that addressed?
I'll give you a real live example. 11 o'clock yesterday afternoon, our systems were attempted to be penetrated by a denial to service. So they're flooding your network. That flooding of the network slows down your network, and at that point, we pick it up on our firewalls, we shut the traffic down, and then we do forensics on that. Within an hour, we report that to the ESISAC. That ISAC is our sector group that we use to facilitate that type of information. Now, I go back to my original point that I made earlier. That happened to me. I venture to say that that same actor was scanning other networks and that same DDoS attack was being attempted. At 4 o'clock, we get an acknowledgement back from the government that they received the information. As of 11 o'clock, or 24 hours later, I still don't have a response back from the government. There's a good example of the timeliness of information. If we could share that information real time within the industry, think about the potential of being able to collaborate very quickly and take action, because most likely that actor has shut down their server and they've moved on. And so we have no time, again, to take any reasonable mitigation steps. The good news is our security systems worked. To the extent that that threat I reported gets communicated, it does get communicated. Most likely it'll be a few months from now. It'll be watered down. And the real sad part about it is it doesn't have the level of detail to take any action on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And before I go to the gentleman from New York, if I can just take 1 second here. So what you just described, Mr. Gaines, gets back to those conferences. If you could come in with that kind of information in real time to everybody that was in a like business and say, expect this kind of attack, is that a doable deal?
I would, if I may, please,
Sure.
I would argue slightly different. I have security clearance, and to the gentleman's point, Homeland Security does offer briefings to those that have security clearance. They're non-industry specific, so they can be across any sector. And ironically, the same approaches that an actor uses in finance is very similar to an attempt that they would use in our industry. That's still not soon enough. Those briefings occur once every 3 months.
But is there no platform to broadcast this information industry-wide? And let's be energy industry specific. Is there no platform for that?
There is. My point being is it's not timely enough.
Okay.
There is, and,
All right.
and it's a very good tool. It's not timely enough, and it's not detailed enough.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the gentleman from New York's indulgence. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our panelists. The line between federal and state power has historically been drawn at the intersection between the high-voltage transmission system and the lower-voltage distribution system. However, the relevance of this distinction is less clear when it comes to cybersecurity, and Ms. Lee, you addressed some of that with the new technologies. But to both you and Mr. Gaines, Ms. Lee and Mr. Gaines, could the increase of smart grid and distributed energy technologies being deployed on the electrical distribution system increase those cybersecurity risks to the high-voltage transmission system?
Let Ms. Lee start off.
As I said in my statement, the increase in technology and the inclusion of IT and communications, the new technology, yes, that does increase the potential for cybersecurity events. I will add another one, and that is the interconnection of these systems. If we look at the new technology, our distributed energy resources, renewable devices, where you transmit the electricity that may be generated in one state to another state, all of that increases the attack surface and the potential for cybersecurity events. On the other side, utilities, reliability is number one. Cybersecurity should support the reliability of the grid. And there are a number of tools and techniques that the electric sector has been using for decades to address reliability that can also be used to address cybersecurity. This is not a totally foreign area. And so it's taking advantage of what they're currently doing and then looking at the techniques and technologies that the IT community uses to address these new threats.
Thank you. And Mr. Gaines, do you also concur that it increases risk here?
If I may, not to differ, I might add a different perspective.
Okay.
If I could, please. The distribution system and the transmission system are two separate systems. The distribution system is a regional, local system, and smart grid and or tied to that smart grid is a meter. That's an individual IP address. It's an individual computer. Think of it like that. There are securities around that through a certificate and encryption. And in our design, that particular meter is not tied into our core distribution system. We have what we call a head-end system that sits outside of our company. So I would suggest to you that from a smart meter and smart grid perspective, the design and construct of that is secure. Is there a risk? In our cases in Pennsylvania, we have 2 million customers, and I'm convinced given enough time with a bad actor, they could figure out how to be destructive with that. But to the extent that our design and configuration within the industry and our design and configuration is very similar to most smart grids, and the technology is very similar. So there's a risk, but I don't see it as a huge threat.
And no specific recommendations you would make to address that increased risk, either of you?
I would just, the gentleman, Mr. Stacey, made some very good points. I think good hygiene is important, good engineering is important, and constant management. These devices are now computers, and so they have to be maintained. They don't have the life of an existing meter, which is 20 to 30 years. These devices have a life of between 5 to 7 years. And so the challenge that the industry has is making sure they maintain their smart grid environment, not neglect it.
Ms. Lee?
There are things that the industry, as Mr. Gaines said, is doing, and I mentioned in my testimony, all utilities do risk assessments. They need to prioritize their system, prioritize the risks and vulnerabilities, and then make decisions about which ones they want to mitigate. They do not have unlimited resources. Utilities deal with many areas of risk. Cybersecurity is one area, and they need to prioritize and determine what they want to do for their mitigation strategies and then make decisions that way.
There was some exchange, thank you, there was some exchange over the role of forensics in cybersecurity. What do we need, this is to all of you, what is needed to adequately conduct a forensic analysis after a cyber event? What are the best?
I'll let you direct it to me, sir.
Any of the four.
Two things. First of all, there needs to be, I go back to what we can share and what we cannot share with the government during an incident. There's a lag that occurs there. If I have a major incident in my environment, I have to report that to several agencies. That can be days or weeks in some cases. Secondly, once we determine it truly was a cyber incident, then I have to put together a full investigative report. And then it goes through a very lengthy process of determining the actual degree or significance of that. I suggest to you that we cut all that or most of that away, and that if I truly know that I've been breached inside of my network, I think there's an obligation that we work much closer with the federal government on a real-time basis of defining the problem first, and then let's go assess the penalties or determine who was at fault later. And that lag at times can be weeks and months before we actually get into the real forensics and do the real, what I think are important things, are mitigating it. And more importantly, that information is not shared with the industry in some cases for a year.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for your insight today. Mr. Wilshusen, I'll direct this question to you, but others may wish to add in on it. I've visited several power generating facilities, and I was pleased to find out that the control systems inside the power plants are totally isolated from the outside world in the facilities I visited, so the chance of a cyber attack on the actual generating facilities is pretty much mitigated unless a bad actor got into the facility and messed with the control system, which could cause a huge issue. So when we're talking about a cyber attack, what physically are the risks there, since these power plants are basically just getting a demand signal from the grid? What kind of destruction do you anticipate could happen from a cyber attack?
Well, first of all, I will first ask about your premise that the internal or the industrial control systems networks are indeed isolated and separated from other external networks or company communications networks. What we have found and what I had seen reported through ICS CERT and others is that often companies believe their industrial control systems networks may be air-gapped, if you will, but are surprised to find when in fact they are not. And with the introduction increasingly of information and communications technologies, we're finding increasingly that these networks are indeed interconnected with other networks. And so that's one thing, but given that, and if they are air-gapped, it does provide an additional level of security, certainly, to where remote access may not be available and where an attacker may have to have physical access to the device. But it is, to be sure, that's something that if they are air-gapped, that is an improvement in the control over it. And that's what has been historically, but increasingly we're finding, and what's being reported, is that they are being interconnected with internal and external networks.
So
thereby, as Ms. Lee mentioned, increasing the attack surface and increasing the likelihood of a potential incident over those industrial control systems networks.
So is that the main concern with cyber attacks, is getting into those
Well,
power
that's-
generating facilities control systems, or is it more to protect the distribution and transmission systems?
Well, I think you have that probably at multiple sections throughout the entire electricity grid, depending upon where the control systems or the sensors are located. If they are indeed interconnected to external networks, there's an increased likelihood that they may be vulnerable to attack if they're not sufficiently hardened. Of course, there are actions that an entity can take to better secure those connections and to better secure those devices. If those are being done, that will help. But historically, that always hasn't been done for a number of reasons.
It just seems like it would be a good operating protocol to have those industrial control systems isolated from the outside world, as far as having the best way to keep a cyber attack from happening on one of those facilities.
Yes, that's correct, but often they're interconnecting in order to provide greater efficiency and usefulness, if you will. And so there's always that balance, but yes, it would be better from a security perspective to keep them isolated.
So when we talk about the role that smart grid technology plays in creating cyber vulnerabilities, does the fact that the smart grid relies on two-way communication make the grid more susceptible to cyber attacks? And if so, how is that?
Well, potentially, and that would be, as Mr. Gaines mentioned, more at the distribution level rather than at the power generating and transmission level, if you will, where there could be attacks, if you will, against individual smart meters. And indeed, I believe there have been reported attacks against smart meters, but more for the purpose of committing fraud and addressing some of the programming that is in those smart meters. But the threat potentially is, and again, with absent other controls that may now be in place, is that collectively, with as millions of smart meters out there, could that have an impact on the larger electricity grid? And that's something that's there potentially could.
And when you talk about smart meter, are you talking about the meters that give the feedback, or just the ones that the meter reader can drive through the neighborhood and read the meter without getting out of the vehicle, or those?
Yeah, that would be included in that, yes.
I think I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking members for today's very important hearing. In Connecticut, we're very focused on grid reliability, just actually from natural disasters we've been coping with, and certainly the cybersecurity threat has gotten us all to pay much closer attention. I have two quick questions. First, for Ms. Lee and Mr. Gaines, can you explain a little bit more how we should address the challenges between the difference in lifespan of operational technology and information technology? All of us who know, who have any of those devices in our pockets, or if you've got teenagers, you really know within a year they want a new one. And yet we're looking at overall systems on the utility side that are decades long. What do we know about from prior history that can help us in Congress think about how to meld together these two systems, one of which is highly capital intensive over decades and another which is changing constantly?
Ms. Lee, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the difference in life cycle, and it's amazing when you think our devices, if it's a year old, it's ancient. What needs to be done, and talking about the modernization of the grid, and I think of that more than just the smart grid, if you want to talk about all of the domains, generation, transmission, and distribution. The new devices are using commercially available operating systems and applications rather than the proprietary solutions that were used historically. And so when you look at these devices, yes, they may have a lifespan of 30 or 40 years, but you have Windows, you have your internet protocols. It's having the two communities, and Mr. Gaines talked about that, having the communities, the IT and OT communities together figure out the best solutions. And a lot of utilities are putting them in the same room and addressing these difficulties, because when you get away from the proprietary solutions, you need to figure out how do you do it with all of these commercially available products.
I would add to that two things you heard me in the testimony. We have and are converging both the operational side of our business and the IT side of our business, and we're doing it a lot with technology, first of all. Inside of a substation, 15 years ago, it was an analog substation, and it was not two-way communication. What sits in a substation now is a communications network. And so we are building out with inside substations a very protected, secure network inside of that substation. And it comes with cyber risk, but it also comes with the ability to monitor that substation. And so that is the piece that some of those in industry are doing. We are thinking of that substation as a physical asset as well as a logical asset. And so when I actually manage our substations, I think of them as a computer, I think of them as an asset in transmitting and or transferring energy, and in one place we look at both of those. We don't separate those two. We don't separate the operational side of our business from the cyber side or the technology side. And as more communication devices go into substations, that's going to be required.
Thank you. That is very helpful. And just a quick question for anyone who wants to chime in. Part of what we do is direct research dollars from this committee. And if you had to divide up the federal research dollars on cybersecurity in prevention, detention, mitigation, and recovery, at this stage of the game, what do you think for us, those of us who sit here in Congress, as we're allocating funds, and we all know we should have more funds, but with the not enough money that we have, as I think about it, how should we think about dividing those up?
Mine would be prevention. It has the greatest opportunity to be able to share, and I think the greatest opportunity to expand and grow.
Yes, thank you for the question. I would offer that we're spending an awful lot today on the measure countermeasure. The threats and the daily bombardment is consuming most of our resources. We need to make sure that we're investing a significant amount of our research dollars in how do we take some of these critical assets off the table. with either some kind of disruption zone is now a terminology that's being used, where you put some kind of an analog
Firewall? A firewall?
Well, it's not quite as sophisticated as a firewall. It's an analog circuit that allows the electrons to go in and only do one thing, and it requires the cyber hacker to have physical access to the other side. And so research associated with trying to help define the critical assets, and then how do we create an environment to take some of these critical assets off the table. So to answer your question shortly, I believe more needs to be done to get us out of this paradigm of measure, countermeasure, and how are we going to solve this long term, because frankly, the resources aren't scalable. Thank you.
Thank you, that's very helpful, yes. Well, remember Mad Men and spy versus spy. We need to, I think you're right, we need to be removing assets from vulnerability. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you all very much.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming in this morning. This is extremely important. Mr. Gaines, the National Institute for Standards and Technology has developed voluntary guidelines for smart grid cybersecurity, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission continues to approve industry cybersecurity standards. How helpful are these types of standards to the industry?
The standards are invaluable. They create a baseline. However, I suggest to you that's just what they are, as a baseline, and that the threats that we see today are going forward. They're not going back. And so we identify most of the vulnerabilities associated with those standards and things that happen to us, not what things are going to happen to us. And I don't think that you can regulate or put standards in this to control every vulnerability. What I think you have to have is a collaborative effort across industry and government to address some of the issues that we have.
Part of my concern is that these are industry standards, and James Clapper, the National Director, or the Director of National Intelligence, said the greatest threat to our national security are cyber attacks. I think he identified 140 attacks against U.S. corporations by China, and it appears to me that we're in the middle of a digital arms race in terms of cyber attacks. And specifically, my concern right now is with our energy infrastructure, and how devastating it would be if we had a cyber attack against our infrastructure that shut it down. Do you think industry standards alone are enough, or does the government need to take a more active role in this, particularly in developing the technology to protect us against cyber attack?
I first of all answer your first question, are the standards adequate? They are adequate, and I repeat again, they create a baseline. If you would suggest, though, that could more be done, I do. And I apologize, I don't remember the member's name. More research needs to be put into technology, number one. And it can be on any one of those three fronts. Prevention is the area that I suggest. Information sharing is a big piece of that. How we can be more collaborative and develop tools between government and industry to share, and within industry. And so I would suggest where the government can be a major player is they have access to information we don't, and vice versa. And the idea is, how can we get that to be a timely sharing of information and a more detailed level of sharing of information? That's the area that I suggest that we put more emphasis on, not necessarily standards.
Well, in regard to the timeliness, Mr. Stacey, in your testimony, you mentioned that intrusion detection technology is not well developed for control system networks, and that it can often be months before malware is detected. What are the factors that account for such a significant amount of time that elapses before detection?
Well, first, let me characterize, as Ms. Lee did, the difference between IT technology and OT. With IT technology, we're fairly mature now in proactively managing systems. We have configurations and patchings that we use to manage these systems. Operational technology or industrial control systems may manage several hundreds or even thousands of points a minute. And if you try to proactively manage that network, you can do a denial of service attack on yourself. And so the tools today are basically passive monitoring, watching for things in and out. And the sophisticated hackers are aware of that and can go slow and low. And so the detection oftentimes, as I said, comes from a third party. And this is another research area that could be invested in, is the detection technology for industrial control systems. Thank you.
Is that, in your opinion, where we need to go in terms of improving the detection time?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from California is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists. You know, this issue, it seems to evolve faster than we can stay pace with it, whether it's hacks or breaches that occur on the private sector side, or hacks and breaches that we're seeing at OPM or other federal agencies that have, certainly compromised millions of people's personal information. And so I guess my first question is, if one of our power grids went down tomorrow in a major metropolitan area because of a cyber attack, would anyone here be surprised? Just a yes or no, up and down. Mr. Stacey, yes or no?
It's certainly possible.
But would you be surprised if it happened? If you learned tomorrow that, say, the San Francisco Bay Area was out of power because of a cyber attack, would that surprise you?
No.
Mr. Gaines?
Yes, it would.
Ms. Lee? Yes, it would. And Mr. Wilshusen? Yes, it would. Okay, and so for those who said, well, let me start with you, Mr. Stacey. Why would it not surprise you?
I just believe because our monitoring and detection for those kinds of events is not sophisticated enough for me to give an answer of yes.
Do you believe that we have made the necessary investments across our country in protecting against cyber attacks? And not just the investments, but is our workforce trained in a way that our cyber hygiene is good enough to prevent this from happening?
Yes, I think we have invested properly. I think there's a lot of work being done both in the utility sector and within the government sector. I think we're short of staff, certainly, and we're working on that in a number of areas with universities, et cetera. But we've heard from several leaders within the federal government that we likely have people inside the infrastructure, and these are very complex systems, and the complexity, even independent of a malware attack, adds a level of vulnerability.
Great, thank you. And for the three who said they would be surprised if they learned tomorrow that a major metropolitan area had been hit, can you just maybe elaborate briefly on why it would surprise you? Maybe Mr. Gaines.
I'll give you a fact-based answer.
Sure.
And I certainly know that there are vulnerabilities that exist in every network. But I would suggest to you at FirstEnergy, I feel we have done the right things to secure our company and that component of the grid. The other thing that's unique to the grid is we have the interconnects, in our case PJM. And so in this case, we would work very hard with PJM, given that if our company was breached, to minimize that impact across the network. Is it possible? Yes, but your black and white answer is, would I be surprised? Yes, I would be.
Sure.
And it's because of those two specific entities. And I would suggest to you the peers around me that are on PJM and the grid probably have the same level of confidence that their business, their company is secure also.
Great, thank you. Ms. Lee?
Yes, I will agree completely with Mr. Gaines on that. And just add to that, if you look at, and was referenced earlier, the Metcalf attack, that their end result was no power failure. The reliability of the grid is paramount, and as he mentioned, working with the interconnections and the different utilities, the intent is to maintain the reliability of the grid. So yes, it is a hypothetical possibility, but if you look at all that's in place to ensure the reliability, it still is a very stable system.
And can you tell me who you fear an attack would come from if it occurred? Do you think it would be a state actor or a non-state actor? Which one would be more likely based on your experience and what you've learned? Mr. Wilshusen.
I think initially I would say it's probably going to be a non-state actor, but I think there are also, I've been reading where there could be state actors involved too. but certainly terrorists and groups that may wish to do us harm would do so. I think state actors would probably depending upon the state, they also are relying on the electricity in our national economy to support them as well.
Great. And Mr. Gaines, are you cleared? Do you have a security clearance?
I do have a security clearance.
Do you feel that enough people in your company are cleared to work with the federal government on the threats, or could we do a better job of reading more people in?
I don't think it's the volume, it's the quality. And I would suggest that today I have secret, that it would be beneficial to move a smaller group to top secret. And the difference there is this, and it gets back to the timeliness and the level of detail. And for the sensitivity of my clearance, I just have to leave it at that, is that it would be much more beneficial to see things on a timely basis and at a much deeper level to be able to take action. But I feel at this point it's adequate, but could be improved.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Back to Mr. Stacey's lack of surprise at an attack. I was talking with our ranking member here, and it's kind of like a lot of terrorism. What is it we say, that we have to be 100% vigilant, diligent all the time? They have to be lucky one time. So I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Muhlenar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gaines, I wanted to follow up with you on some of your comments. You had talked about the area of prevention and thinking about what we could do to complement the efforts you're doing in the industry. And you talked about, prevention investments maybe there could be benefits across industries. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Across the industry.
Across the industry.
Across the industry
Yes.
itself. And I do have to come back to this issue, and I know it's uncomfortable maybe to repeat it again, but we do have in the industry a set of standards, and those standards hold us to a level, and if we're not compliant, then there's liability. And I think that has to be looked at first, because there's not the lack of interest in wanting to be able to share from an industry, but there's certainly a level of hesitancy at times at what level we share. So I remind us of that. To that point, though, I don't think it can be done on a voluntary basis. I think that there has to be an open, collaborative environment between the government, and I speak of probably 2 or 3 agencies that I think we could all do a better job. And I start out with Homeland because they own the infrastructure. I start out with DOE because they are our sector control. Those are 2. The third would be the FBI because they become the investigative arm in the event that something happens. I do believe that there is a way with the industry to be able to collaborate real-time threat analysis information. And it isn't a voluntary, but rather a requirement that should occur. But it does start with the issue of our ability to be able to manage that directly, industry to government.
So it sounds to me like some of the effort, you're talking about people getting together in a room and meeting and discussing this. You aren't talking about major investments in infrastructure or some kind of technology. You are talking.
I am talking about both. I'm talking about the industry being able to have the necessary technology within their company to be able to provide that level of information. And I'm talking about the government being able to have and being a recipient and being able to use it. So it's technology and it's also skills and resources.
And do you think that when you think about prevention, you prevent one threat, but then another threat emerges that you weren't aware of? How long are the benefits from that kind of an investment? How long does that last?
I think that's one of the things Mrs. Lee talked about is that becomes a priority. Where do we focus on first? I don't think you can deal with every single threat. There's a lot of work that's being done in the industry right now to define what a critical asset is, and it's very good work. The gentleman asked me, are the standards good? They're really good. They create a baseline. I can tell you within our company, what are, by definition, the critical substations that have an impact on our entire network. Now, if I start there just alone with those critical assets and you multiply that times 120 investor-owned utilities, that's pretty valuable information. And so, and again, I don't want to give you any idea how many that is, other than to say it is a manageable number.
And just, it was mentioned earlier, this idea of improving early detection. And I don't know if that was you, Mrs. Lee, or who it was that talked about the importance of that. Is that where we should be focusing?
I will add, I think early detection is important. One of the difficulties, and I believe it's been discussed here, is when you have an event, it can be very difficult to determine whether it's a cybersecurity event. I've done exercises with utilities, and their frustration was, I didn't know it was a cybersecurity event. So it's a matter of, and we talked about on the protection side, but also, as we've all discussed, you're using commercially available products. They have built-in vulnerabilities. The utilities are, as they're developing their mitigation strategies, you have to assume your systems at some point are going to be compromised. And so you take that as a given. It may be not significant, but you use that when you develop your mitigation strategy. So I think it's a combination of looking at it from the protection side, but then what do you do if there is a cybersecurity event? You want the electricity to continue to flow.
Mr. Wilhausen?
Yes, I would agree with that too, because I know there's been a lot of discussion about the standards out there, and that's fine, and they may be adequate. But what also needs to happen is the implementation of those standards consistently over time throughout the enterprise. And in our work at federal agencies and other entities, that often does not occur. Vulnerabilities exist because standards aren't being implemented consistently over time across the enterprise. And so it's through that attacks often occur. So the monitoring aspect of the effectiveness of the security controls is going to be also a key part of the overall defense and strategy, or defense in depth strategy.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stacey, let me start with you at the kind of the 30,000-foot view. If we have a full-scale cyber attack, what does it do to the nation's economy and to the nation's security infrastructure?
It would be significant. All the other infrastructures run off the energy infrastructure.
All right, and that leads me to the next question. How often is a cyber attack or an attempted attack tried on our nation's power grid?
What I can tell you is that from ICS CERT, they're seeing a 32% increase in FY14 of targeted attacks on the energy sector. I don't have the specific number for the grid.
Okay, but it has increased in the last...
It is increasing.
And I read something in USA Today that the U.S. power grid faces physical or online attacks approximately once every 4 days. Is that a fairly accurate statement, you think?
That's fair.
Okay. That's all, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all of the witnesses being here. Apologize that I wasn't here for the earlier testimony, but we also have Homeland Security issues going on that I'm doing the ping pong between the committees. But prior to coming to Congress, I spent 30 years in the IT industry. 20 of that time I had my own business. And a good portion of our business was going into smaller utility systems and helping them automate. So I have some background in this, predominantly smaller municipal co-op systems to where we would put fiber optics into the city to tie the different SCADA systems together, pump stations, substations, et cetera, so they can more effectively monitor, getting more to a smart grid. During that time, many of those smaller operations saw the value of bringing in revenue, especially in small utilities, of selling the interconnectivity to businesses that had multiple locations within their jurisdiction. That also led to bringing in high-speed internet, which allowed them to connect and sell internet services on the same backbone, the same infrastructure that was also running their devices. Now, of course, we put in a lot of technology to segregate those networks, but at the same time, they also saw the functionality of being able to monitor and manage and respond without having to be in the office to an incident that happened within the utility system through the use of the internet. So as we were trying to implement these new technologies to allow them to be more efficient in operating their utility, and many of those provide electricity throughout their cities or their area of responsibility, it did help a lot, but then there was the concern that we had of someone from the outside being able to get in. And so what we would do is we would do a lot of research, and one of the things that we did not have was an approved products list that we could go to, that the government had said, all right, if you use this type of gateway, use this firewall, use this type of filter, then we know it'll be secure. So we did a lot of research. We went to a lot of vendors, and we would get what we believed was the most secure, put that into place, and in most cases, we were under contract to maintain it, make sure the security updates were done, the patches, et cetera, et cetera. The next progression was to then put in the other elements of the smart grid for meter reading and all this. So some of the things we started looking at were points of access, points of failure, points of vulnerability, which grew exponentially once we started adding the more technology. In a previous committee, I brought up the lack of an approved products list that vendors such as myself or these smaller electric utilities can go to. That has standards, equipment standards, standards of practice, operation, et cetera. Now, I understand the Department of Energy is working on that, and I applaud that effort. But I do believe, and I know that there is a lot of vulnerability accessing the grid, you may say, through smaller electric utility systems. Some of those that we put equipment in, we went out and spent a lot looking at the security aspect of it to make sure that they could operate securely. Because of budget cuts, many of them would cut our contract and manage it themselves. And then some of them would actually go and buy parts off of eBay because they were cheaper. But I would try to emphasize to them there's a reason that part is on eBay. It's probably because it has been discontinued for a security reason. Can any of you that would like to comment on where we are, where we're going, and the need to get to, if you feel that there is a need to have a standard set of standards for equipment, for upgrade, for maintenance, and operation, with these smaller utilities as well as large?
Well, I'll speak as a large utility. I can't speak for a small utility. That would not be accurate for me to do.
You may be able to opine as far as the vulnerability, how vulnerability of the small utilities affect the larger utility.
Well, I'll try to answer your question directly, though, regarding standards associated with equipment, software, technologies. I think there certainly has to be some level of verification, validation of equipment. To the extent that you could create a universal standard for every type of equipment that sits inside of a network, I think it would be very difficult, and the question is who would monitor and manage that? That is the challenge, and it ranges from software to hardware. I do think there are some validation points, though, that you can put in. Do you have, as you're building software or you're building equipment, a method of configuring it so that it could be personal to the company versus a standard set of passwords that are set in a piece of software, as an example? Those are things that you could do to design into the technology. As it relates to the vulnerability between a small utility, municipal or not, we work together very well in the industry, between our industry association, EEI, groups like EPRI who do research for us. And so I would tell you that there's very little distinction about what the expectations are on a small utility versus a large utility.
Thank you for the question. I'd offer this perspective. Right now, vendors are offering equipment with as much flexibility as they can, with as much functionality as they can, and that's adding to the complexity. If, as a sector, there was work done on how do I minimize the functionality to really what I need, that the valve only opens and closes as fast as I need for an emergency response, and that sensors on the pipe managing flow or only have the fidelity for managing the flow. As we reduce that complexity, initially that would cost more because you're asking for something that's different. But as an industry, as they worked on reducing the complexity and trying to find components that did the minimum functionality required to manage within an industrial control system, I think there'd be some benefits to that.
Is there currently a rating system or an evaluation that is used as far as how secure a utility is in their operation?
In terms of vendor equipment?
The whole footprint, the entire topology. Is there a method that an independent organization or the government can come in and evaluate and give some type of security rating?
Yes, there is. The SIP standards, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards, are a set of standards that originated in 2005. We're on version 5 right now, and they baseline the transmission system and the security around that through those standards, and then they are auditable. And to the extent there is remediation associated with those audits, they're managed accordingly. FERC administers those through NERC.
Okay. Does the gentleman yield back?
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, so I will yield back the time I don't have remaining.
All right, the gentleman yields. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleagues on the committee for allowing me to sit in on this today. It's an area of extreme interest and importance in my regard. I spent nearly 30 years as an information technology professional. Part of that time, a large part of that time in the Department of Defense, being concerned about the security of data systems that support our special operations folks and things like that. I feel very, very strongly that cybersecurity is an issue across the spectrum. It's getting a lot of talk, but it's not getting a lot of focused attention to address the issue. It's an issue, and I don't know if the four of you agree or not. It's not something that's got a finish line. You know, this is not something that we're going to solve and then we're going to move on to the next big problem. As long as the world is connected with computing systems and networks, you're going to have those with the wherewithal, some of them because they can, some of them because they desire to create chaos with malicious or criminal intent, are going to try to get into our networks. And our energy systems and our power grids are one of those areas that would wreak havoc on America's economy, and I think we can all agree with that. Mr. Gaines, what in your mind does the integration of IT systems and supervisory control and data acquisition systems have in increasing the risk to grid operations?
First of all, Mr. Johnson, hello. It's good seeing you again.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. I would like to start out by saying I don't think it's if, it's when. The OT, operational systems technologies, and the IT technologies are merging, and they go back to exactly what I suggested, that in a substation now, it looks like a small communications network. It's got a device in it that communicates with most of the assets, transformers, that determine the health and, in fact, the condition of those transformers. Mm-hmm. That's all communicated back to the SCADA system into the IT systems. Secondly, the IT systems are tied to our power grid and actually help us manage and monitor that from a generation perspective. I think the industry is moving to converge those not necessarily manage them as you would manage them on the grid as an operator, but manage that space so that, one, they understand the health of it, they understand the reliability of it, and the impacts that cyber, specifically cyber, has on it. I go back to the Metcalf incident. There were 3 things that occurred within an hour: the cutting of a communication line, the actual assault on the location itself, and then the loss of load. Those all 3 were done within an hour, and they were in the space that if you would have had monitoring and the ability to alert and manage that, I wouldn't suggest that you could avoid, but you could have mitigated some of the issues.
Can you talk specifically about what FirstEnergy is doing to mitigate this vulnerability?
Yes. We, in fact, have, over the past 12 months, built a security operations center, and we manage all 3 of those from one center. So I manage the operations and the health of those physical assets. We look at that from a IT perspective and overlay IT to that, and then I physically monitor the station through cameras, video, and X-ray. And so I see that single pane, as we define it, I see that single pane of our critical assets, and that's not dispersed around the company. I don't have a physical security desk, I don't have a operating center, and I don't have a cyber center. I have one operation center that looks at that, and they're not looking at it on multiple systems, they're looking at it on one system. We are one of the first in the industry. We've worked with EPRI very hard, so the industry gets it, and there's a lot of work being done there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I had other questions, but I think I've exhausted my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Gentleman yields back. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.